Welcome to a new episode of InFocus with Ejaz Haider. Before I get to my take and the guests, a word about this program. InFocus is sponsored by the Center for Security, Strategy and Policy Research. CESPR is an autonomous policy research center housed in the University of Lahore, and its menu consists of issues that make up contemporary security and strategic developments. Well, now to my take. The Strait of Hormuz is once again the flashpoint. On 6 July, Iran's IRGC Navy targeted 3 commercial ships sailing under US protection through Omani waters. The US retaliated with airstrikes, and President Trump declared the ceasefire and the MOU over. He was in Ankara at the NATO conference. Iran has suspended its obligations. Both sides are firing, but neither has formally walked away from the agreement. Is this just another round of brinkmanship, or are we watching the MOU sink in the Gulf waters? Let me start with a simple observation. Analysts blaming Iran for this flare-up have got it wrong. The criticism comes in various forms. Iran is being intransigent. Tehran should have prioritized sanctions relief over controlling the strait. The hardliners in the IRGC were never happy with the MOU and have sabotaged it. This analysis suffers from framing bias. The analysis cannot start the clock at the moment Iran fired at the ships, nor is the US Navy escort operation neutral, innocent, and a passive guarantee of global comment. Any proper analysis must include the antecedent, the US decision to escort ships through what it calls the southern route, and recognize that action as a provocative military posture in Iran's backyard. So operational empathy is important. Iran's actions cannot be figured out without understanding how it perceives America's actions. Tehran sees the US operation as an attempt to project force in its waters, attempting to erode its control over its most strategic asset. This is a classic security dilemma. One side's security becomes the other's threat. So what's really at stake? It's not about the fees, it's not about money, it's about sovereignty. Iran has discovered that control of the strait is its trump card, its most powerful leverage. And the US has discovered that if it allows Iran to exercise that control, it loses a crucial strategic advantage. For Iran, sovereign control over the strait translates into the ability to do 2 things: raise the cost of any US military action by choking off shipping and denying the US Navy free access to and from its 5th Fleet headquarters in Manama and generally in the Gulf. Iran's strategy is both immediate and long-term. Immediately, it wants to raise the cost of war. Long-term, it wants to force the US out of its vicinity. Every attack on US bases in the Gulf is designed to make regional states realize a painful truth. US protection doesn't make them safer, it makes them targets. But what of the MOU itself? Clause 5 is clear. It states that Iran will make arrangements for safe passage of commercial vessels free for 60 days and will conduct dialogue with Oman to define future administration. When the clause explicitly makes Iran responsible for safe passage in and out of the strait, that also means Iran can choose which route it wants the ships to take. The US interpretation that it can escort ships through the southern route without any coordination with Iran violates the principle of good faith. This is not a technical disagreement. This is a battle over who controls the strait. But here's the deeper point I want to leave you with. The memorandum of understanding was never a settlement. I've said this before. It was a temporary reprieve from all-out war so that 2 sides could work out a deal. That argument rests on 2 other points. The MOU is only a framework agreement. The nuclear file, the sanctions, the broader strategic issues all remain unresolved. Second, and more importantly, there is an ongoing existential war between Iran and the Zionist state. That war involves structural factors that no US-Iran agreement can resolve. They will remain with or without this MOU. So where does this leave us? Both sides are testing each other's will. The US is trying to break Iran's control over the strait. Iran is refusing to give up its most powerful leverage. The MOU is caught in the middle. As for where it could go from here, that's where my guests come in. I have with me Dr. Assal Rad, a historian of the modern Middle East. She works on research and writing related to US foreign policy, the Middle East, contemporary Iran, and Palestine. She writes for a number of internationally acclaimed publications and is a regular commentator on international channels. She's also the author of The State of Resistance, Politics, Culture, and Identity in Modern Iran, which was published by Cambridge University Press in 2022. And I highly recommend the book. Sina Toossi is a writer, editor, and researcher and studies U.S. foreign policy, the Middle East, and Iran. He is currently a senior non-resident fellow at the Center for International Policy and also writes a substack newsletter called Dissident Foreign Policy. His work sits at the intersection of policy research, human rights advocacy, and public engagement. He regularly writes for Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, USA Today, and other outlets. Viewers can find out more about his achievements and collection of writings at sinatoossi.com. So, salam and khush amadeen to the program, both of you. It's great to have you here. And let me begin with Sina because I want to start with what's happening, kind of an inverted pyramid, and then broaden the discussion. And as I said, that there is a serpent in the Eden also called the Zionist entities, and Assal has been commenting on that and writing about and researching that. So it's kind of, we'll link it up. So Sina, I'm being mean by raising the question of where it's going to go. Predictions are always tricky, and I've thrown the ball in your court. So let's begin with, where do you think it's headed now?
Yeah, well, I mean, the critical issue, as you laid out, is a major security interest or geopolitical interest for both sides, namely the Strait of Hormuz and transit through the Strait of Hormuz. So the issue from the Iranian side really boils down to this total lack of trust and no credibility, really, for the U.S. to deliver sanctions relief, to follow up on its commitments that it made in the MOU. And, that's been borne out not just by this MOU and, the U.S. not really abiding by its clauses, including, ending the Lebanon war, getting Israeli withdrawal from there. The U.S. has been resisting releasing Iran's frozen assets, which it was obligated to do under the MOU. And going further back, many, many examples of the Iranians agreeing to an agreement with the United States and the U.S. reneging on its commitments. Obviously, the JCPOA, the 2015 nuclear deal, was the most prominent, but there's many other examples. So what Hormuz gives Iran is leverage. I mean, and it's decisive leverage that for the first time, really, in a major way, Iran can enact costs on its adversaries, on the United States, on the global economy, and really raise the cost of trying to punish Iran, trying to attack Iran, and creating all these problems for Iran. And so that is not something that they want to let go. And I think, they want maximum leverage over this strategic choke point for the global economy. It's not just that, okay, in this warlike situation, when war broke out, when, there was no more red lines really for any side, that Iran attacked ships, it closed the strait. But, if it takes for itself and creates for itself this capability to designate what routes ships should go through the northern part of the strait, that it eventually creates this new governance structure, which it's wanted to do with Oman, but I think it's going to do either way. And it can, collect fees, collect tolls, or they're calling it service fees, and basically maintain this leverage. So in the future, if it does reach an agreement with the United States, that it's going to have this lever. It's going to have this lever to basically control who goes through the strait, to if America doesn't abide by its commitments and it reverses sanctions relief, as it has done on numerous occasions, that Iran could not only engage in other forms of leverage it's had or try to increase them, which are much more difficult for it, like rebuilding its nuclear program, reconstituting its stockpiles of enriched uranium. That was traditionally its biggest bargaining chip with the United States. But Hormuz, it can disallow certain ships to go. It could, use this lever to create costs for the United States and its allies and for pressure against Iran. So I think, for the Iranians, this is really existential, the way I see it, that this was a war that wasn't really aimed at destroying the Iranian state. And I would argue collapsing just the country in terms of being a stable country. It would have, I think, if Trump and Netanyahu even achieved a limited set of their goals, even got to partial success, that Iran would have been destabilized, that, they explicitly wanted to, get the Kurds to move in from Western Iran. They've already, we know that the Israelis and the U.S. have had a hand in destabilizing southeastern Iran near Pakistan and Sistan and Baluchistan province. I think, this risk of total instability of, coupled with these massive assassination campaigns, destroying police stations, all of this stuff. So, the Iranians are very much, they've used this as an existential war. And so they're going to go all out. I think the cost that they're willing to bear, it's much higher because this is their core existence. Whereas for the U.S., control of sea lanes has been a cornerstone of American foreign policy since World War II. This was a major strategic lever that America had over the world, and in terms of projecting its own power and its own dominance. And Hormuz, it doesn't want to set the precedent of Iran now controlling this, of collecting tolls. And I think, they're saying that it is, against international law as it's currently written. But, international law, I think, is obviously subjective. It obviously reflects power. The U.S. and Israel have, don't care about it when it doesn't suit their interests. And I think in this context, the Iranians have had the upper hand. We can get into why I think they've had the upper hand in controlling Hormuz later. But they're not going to let go. And they want to create a new model, a new convention, not unlike, maybe when Egypt nationalized the Suez Canal. Many people are talking about this now with Gamal Abdel Nasser. And, at the time, Britain did everything it can to stop that. It was against international law and whatnot, but they managed to do that. And so I don't think the U.S., Iran is going to let go. So it's just a matter of who's willing to bear more costs. And we can get into that later. But for the U.S., of the continued global ramifications for the energy market, the risk of a much bigger energy and economic crisis, and for the Iran, the accumulating effects of a new reconstituted U.S. blockade, all these heavy bombardments. And, the clock is going to, again, start running down on who's going to kind of bear the most pressure and ultimately give in.
Yeah, I don't think it's about the fees. That's what I've written about. It's more like the expression of sovereignty and, of course, the strategic asset, using it as a strategic asset. I was kind of chuckling when Trump, although he's walked it back, but he said, oh, we're going to get 20% fees. And I was like, here is this guy who just corroborated Iran's position on this. So it was kind of funny. But Assal, this whole idea of the existential threat. Now, there's obviously a background to this. And it's not all ideological, in the sense that Iran has been, after the revolution, I've written an entire book on this, has been very pragmatic at various occasions, even to the extent of getting weapons from the Zionist entity in its war against Iraq. And then, of course, after the US invasion of Afghanistan, Iran played a very important role during the Bonn process. James Dobbins has written about this. Jawad Zarif and he had kind of hit it off, and they used to have coffee every day. And, Iran was offering to help the US stabilize Afghanistan. And then, of course, Iran wanted to have a grand bargain in 2003 and so on. And then, of course, Bush's evil Apax's speech, and the rest, as we say, is history. So there's a whole trajectory. So if one takes a snapshot view of it, one really doesn't get pictures. You've got to have a longitudinal design in order to understand how this is going to work. I want to get your take on, Sina has actually kind of deflected the real thrust of my question by being not too predictive about it. So I'm going to throw it your way. Where do you think, is the MOU dead and buried? Is there something left, or neither side has actually officially annulled it as yet? But the most recent post by Trump, I don't know what he's going to write two hours from now, but his most recent statement is about, a social media statement is that full blockade and all of this is over. So where is it going?
Well, you're not going to like my response, which is, I, especially as a historian, really, really avoid predictions. And I do that as a general rule. But we're in a particularly interesting situation because the figures that we have on, especially on the US side, this administration run by President Trump is extremely unpredictable. There's, he fluctuates so dramatically from one position to another. even in the language he uses, we go from he's going to annihilate an entire civilization, it's never going to come back to life, to here's an agreement between these two sides. It is a very extreme pendulum swing. And so it's difficult to predict behaviors in that sense when they're so erratic. At the same time, there are certain constraints, and I think Sina talked about this and got to it to a certain point. It's how much cost each side is willing to absorb. And I would agree that Iran is clearly willing to absorb more cost because it is a matter of their survival. I mean, another thing that's been floated around as an idea from the Israeli side, you had back in June of last year, the first time Israel started a war with Iran directly, when the Jerusalem Post wrote an editorial board piece urging certain actions that the Trump administration should support or take. And one of them was explicitly to partition Iran. Because if you want to go further back and look at this, I mean, we're talking about, the Strait of Hormuz as this strategic leverage. Iran has understood its power with the Strait of Hormuz for a very long time. They've threatened the idea of closing the Strait of Hormuz over and over again. It was Iran's constrained behavior against clear aggressions from the US and Israeli side. And you can go back to the US withdrawing from the JCPOA in 2018 and imposing maximum pressure sanctions. You can go back to 2020 and the assassination of General Soleimani and another restrained response. Over and over again, Iran's restrained response in order to not escalate was viewed as weakness. But this was something that they understood for a very long time, that they had, because of its geography, they had leverage over this waterway. I think it's important to note ships were moving freely. Like, the idea that this is a security threat for the United States is absurd. It's a security threat the United States created for itself by attacking a sovereign nation that was in no way threatening it. So we're in this position because of US miscalculation. You can go back and look at, say, US miscalculation in 2003 in the invasion of Iraq. We have precedent for these types of miscalculations, often based on a hegemonic view of the region rather than understanding the reality on the ground, the historical reality on the ground of that region. So when you talk about, predictions, Iran is going to control the Strait of Hormuz, not control it in the sense that there's no other countries that are around it, but because of its geography, it's going to be a piece of leverage. The fact that it's an important economic artery globally is not going to change anytime in the near future. So those things are just stated facts. Now, is the MOU dead or alive? I think it's a Schrodinger's cat situation, but you're looking at it as these are just decisions that can be made. And the US can decide to move forward with the MOU if they are doing it in good faith. And that's true on both sides. On the Iranian side, the reason you see a significant shift in their policy or the way they're approaching things strategically is because a lot of the top leadership has been killed by Israel and the United States. So you have fresh leadership and a fresh view of things. That was always going to be the case. When Khamenei would either die or in this case was killed, there was always that moment of rupture that would then see how Iranian politics shifts. And now what's interesting, I think, in this context is that while there is a lot of domestic grievances, rightfully so, within Iran, and we saw that in protests that began in December of 2025, it didn't have the effect of getting the people to rise up and overthrow their government during war, which is what Israel and the US had to some extent hoped for. That's not the response that we saw. We saw a rallying around the nation effect, rather than necessarily a rallying around the flag or the Islamic Republic, but rallying around the nation itself, because to Sina's point, they are facing an existential threat. And Iran's territorial integrity is so crucially important to every single Iranian within not every single Iranian within the diaspora, but it is typically a universal unifying point within a very complex Iranian political landscape, is that Iran's territorial integrity, and this goes back centuries. Again, this is the historical context that's often missing in the Western analysis or in the decision-making, trying to understand their foe, right? If you're trying to understand the Iranian side, threatening that map in any way is the easiest way to get people to rally around that very territory. And that's exactly what we've seen happen. And again, that's not something that I think is going to go away anytime in the near future. So if the current situation or impasse leads to another round of more aggressive fighting, I don't necessarily see, and this is the closest thing you'll hear from a prediction, and this is just based on precedent, that those factors are going to change. You might see more damage, you might see more harm to the global economy, more civilians killed, but you're not going to see a significant shift in those initial positions.
Yeah. One of my friends who's also holds an office at one of the political parties in Pakistan is currently in Iran. He'd gone there for Ali Khamenei's funeral. And we were just exchanging messages, and he said, wherever I turn, I have this Bayat Bakhast, written everywhere. So it's like a national call. But Sina, I want to ask you this whole thing about the hardliners, the Tondro and the moderates. Is there really a fault line that way? Or is it more about the difference of opinion with reference to the pace of negotiations, what exactly can or should be conceded, what are the conditions that are acceptable to Iran? Is it about the way negotiations have to be conducted, or is there really a fault line where you say, oh, these are the hardliners, these are the moderates, and never the twain shall meet?
Yes, no, I think, this traditional paradigm for understanding Iranian domestic politics, that this idea that there's these kind of more moderate, pragmatic factions who are juxtaposed to these kind of intransigent hardliners, I would argue that was always, for the most part, simplistic. But in the broad strokes, yes, Iran has always had a quite strong, and contrary to the conventional wisdom in the West, a camp within the Islamic Republic's system that was very much striving for improving Iran's relations with the US and Europe, and against a lot of the kind of underpinning policies, foreign policies of, let's say, Ali Khamenei. Whereas if Ali Khamenei's grand strategy was more this idea of autarky and self-sufficiency and kind of strategic independence and creating these kind of domestic military programs and regional strategic depth that has been on display in this war, many people within the Islamic Republic were against that, and they viewed it as kind of futile, or the costs weren't worth it. And for many years, these debates have been pretty open. Previously there was Hashemi Rafsanjani or Hassan Rouhani, and there was debates that this path that Iran was on and trying to go basically head to head with the global hegemon, with Israel, that this was a kind of losing battle for Iran. But regardless, since the war, I think this paradigm has really changed, even quite dramatically. Where for example, you see these reports about Ahmadinejad now. I mean, you're seeing that if there was a camp within Iran that kind of was critical of Khamenei's grand strategy or this kind of overarching national security policy by Iran, that the way the U.S. and Israel have handled themselves, including in this framing of like who's overplaying their hand. I would argue the U.S. and Israel overplayed their hand. That if they were much more pragmatic with the realities of Iranian politics, they would have went one way, maybe a much more moderate position. But they went all out, as Assad said, targeting Iran's territorial integrity, all these kind of very barbaric assassinations that I think, whether we believe, for example, this report about Ahmadinejad or not, it seems like he grew disillusioned with it, or the political reality in Iran has grown so much more radicalized in a way, especially amongst the core social base of the Islamic Republic, which is real, which is substantial, which is much more radicalized. But even beyond that, the broader umbrella of Iranians who are just against this attack on their homeland, their country, and the kind of threats that it poses to it. And, this idea of kind of negotiations with America, even this MOU, was very controversial within Iran and Iranian politics beyond the traditional hardliner moderate split. Because of, that Iran was at the negotiating table multiple times. Just in the past year, as Assad said, 2 surprise attacks. Last June was the first one. Pezeshkian and this whole moderate pragmatic camp that for years had staked all of its political capital on engagement with the West, going back decades. And for years, they were spurned and rebuked, foremost, I would argue, not by the domestic hardliners in Iran, which, had an interest in upsetting their plans, but foremost by Israel and America and their policies towards Iran. That was a far more determinative impact on the trajectory of Iranian domestic politics and in exacerbating this security dilemma. And now we're in a situation where, I think my read is broad consensus in Iran on the strategy that they're pursuing. That contrary to these allegations of fracture and division, I see broad consensus from Ghalibaf to Pezeshkian to various people who've been associated with the reformist current to the IRGC and whatnot, that Iran can't let go of Hormuz, and that the U.S. can't be trusted, and there's much more belief in hard power, the international relations. Not that they were ever necessarily naive about it, but that America and Israel have it out to kill Iran. That is their goal. They wanted to kill Iran. They want to kill this system, and that's they have it out for them. So there's really not much choice that they're left with. That's why I think for them, the Hormuz is so existentially important, that if they lose Hormuz and they're like, okay, America's going to promise us sanctions relief, they're going to release assets, they don't trust any of that. And, the political realities in America don't really enable America, even if the U.S. president wanted to give Iran major sanctions relief, overhaul the relationship. There's so many obstacles, including congressional law, including the fact that it would have to go through a waiver process like the JCPOA, and Iran didn't derive any economic benefit from that. So, what Hormuz gives them is a lever that they can control, and they can tie their prosperity to the prosperity of the Persian Gulf and the global economy, and vice versa. If they're going to be punished, if they're going to be put in the penalty box, if they're going to be killed, that they have a lever to enact immense costs for that as well. And then, with the idea being that realpolitik will win the day. I mean, I think they're still pragmatic. People like Ghalibaf and them are still pragmatic, and their goal is really to get the U.S. to back off and to get a deal that is sustainable for them, that delivers real benefit for them. And I think that's going to involve keeping Hormuz. And so, I'll leave it at that.
So, Assal, so I was saying Sina has made this very important point about the US and Israel overplaying that. I just want to get your take on that. You want to add something to that?
Well, it's more about, because when we're talking right now, Sina talked about this idea of really they wanted to destroy Iran. And I mentioned the idea of partition that has floated around. And this has been something that Iranians have, for a very long time on the inside of Iran, that was a concern, right? That the Balkanization of Iran, that was the ultimate goal. And then you saw it stated explicitly by, a significant Israeli outlet. So where is the background of this, and why? Because you'd mentioned earlier something about, Iran is not really looking at it ideologically, they're looking at it pragmatically. What's interesting about this dynamic is that why partition? Why do they want to destroy Iran? It's not ideological necessarily. It's that Iran, as it exists, is a natural power within the region because of its geography, because of its size, its population, its natural resources, its access to a strategic waterway like Hormuz. All of that makes it a natural power within the region. What that does is it doesn't threaten Israel, right? The way that the Israeli ideological side, and that ideology that's been so pervasive within the American political landscape, is that Iran poses an existential threat to Israel. That's the direction in which we've understood the threat, or we've understood as in the Western world, because that's how it's been presented, specifically from Israel, and then, within the American political landscape. The reality of it is, Iran threatens Israeli hegemony in the region, Israel's complete dominance of the region, which we have seen now. Now, the difference of talking about this 3 years ago and talking about this today is Gaza and everything we have seen transpire under this state, which is carrying out a genocide, ethnic cleansing, apartheid, occupation, bombs. It's no longer even bombing its neighbors. It's destroying countries, right? Southern Lebanon is destroyed. And this is the doctrine that they are very, very openly espousing. So it's become more clear that the existential threat was Israel. It's always been in the opposite direction, but that's not the way it's been presented. So the irony is the more highly ideological side is actually the American side. The American political system is much more ideological in the way that it actually creates policy than the Iranian side that's always treated as ideological, because there is no real benefit to, or I should say, there is a greater benefit to the United States if you think of long-term positionality within the region with Iran than with Israel, which is why Iran was, under the monarchy, before 1979 and the revolution, was a huge strategic asset for the United States. That is still the case. And that's why Israel panics at the idea of detente between these two states. The reality of that strategic alliance for the United States is a threat, again, to Israel's hegemony. And that is why you see these the belligerence towards war and the antagonism towards any kind of diplomacy. But that has been infused in the American political ideology. And that's the thing that I think has prevented the US from being able to sort of go over that hurdle and be able to create these pragmatic relationships with Iran.
But, it seems fairly obvious to me that the fact that Iran cannot be a client state of the United States, it cannot be a dependent state. I mean, look at the Gulf states. They're extremely rich. There were all the global investment coming in, tourism and AI and technology and the rest of it. But if this war has proved one thing very clearly, it is that they are basically dependencies. They're not sovereign. Iran wants to be sovereign. And I think that is something, and your point that it doesn't want the Zionist hegemony. If you combine these 2 points, I think there is the Americans and the Zionists can make a very good case about, we need to do something to destroy this state. That's how I look at it. I mean,
I absolutely agree, by the way, because your point about sovereignty and the hegemony is perfect, right? Because it is Iranian sovereignty that threatens Israeli hegemony. If you got rid of the Islamic Republic and you had, the most human rights abiding democratic state in Iran, because this is the language that's used often, right? They're to save the Iranian population. If you did that and this new democratic, utopian society was acting in its own national interest vis-a-vis Israel and the United States, they would have the exact same set of problems, because ultimately it would not allow, any sovereign state would not allow Israel's hegemony.
Yeah. I mean, one can go back. In fact, after the Algiers agreement, the Zionists were like really mad at Reza Shah for pulling back the support from Barzani, and because they wanted the Iraqi army to stay engaged within Iraq and not be able to deploy to the West. So the Zionists were, I mean, you're absolutely right. As a matter of fact, when I did this program with Trita, he told me that he had actually interviewed this. He was, I think, the deputy defense minister or something. I forget the guy's name. And he said to Trita that destroying Hezbollah is actually a step towards going for the destruction of Iran. For the Zionists. So there's this entire, there's this ideological and existential imperative for the Zionists to somehow take out Iran. And Sina talked about southeastern Baloch problem. I mean, we know, our intelligence knows that Mossad has been active in Sistan, Balochistan, and also maybe parts of the Pakistani Balochistan. So we're quite aware of the fact that they've been operating in this area. So Sina, now, if there is a blockade, as Trump says, latest statement, the US strategic oil reserves are at an historic low. I mean, partly because of the Ukraine war, partly because of what has happened in Hormuz. And the Chinese are not going to bail them out. You might recall that after Trump met with Xi, China announced that it's going to cut down on its daily import by almost 5 million barrels per day, so just to stabilize the markets. So I don't think the Chinese can do that now if it kind of prolongs. We have also determined that, Iran has taken and absorbed a lot of pain. So essentially, it's about sustainment. Who can take that kind of pain? So if you look at the oil reserves and if you look at the November elections, do you think Trump can sustain any further escalation?
Yeah. So this clock issue I mentioned earlier, now with the reinstatement of the blockade of Iran, with Iran fully closing Hormuz again, this return to kind of all-out fighting, that similar to what existed before the April ceasefire, we have these clocks that are running down. So for the U.S. is the reserves of the U.S. Strategic Petroleum Reserve, the global energy reserves, along with all the other kind of global economic knock-on effects from Hormuz, but those are the most important. The U.S. Strategic Petroleum Reserve has already been depleting since the Ukraine war quite dramatically, even more sharply since this Iran war, and now they don't have much cushion. So previously, just in April and in March, they were releasing reserves, they were controlling inflation, they were controlling the economic impact of this war. They have much less wiggle room actually now. I think potentially to the order of just a few tens of millions of barrels, which is very little. And then, like you said, for other countries, they have even less cushion space, from Japan to South Korea to Europe. China, I don't think is going to come to bail them out. And so for Iran, it goes to, how much damage can they incur? The blockade was harmful for them, definitely very harmful for them. Now, I think the MOU, to your earlier point, it made a certain logic for both of them in the short term to get some breathing space, to ease these pressures. And Iran has been had been preparing for a blockade for a long time, especially with the Venezuela president. And I'm sure in this past 30, 40, 50 days, they've, doubled down on what they could do during this short period. And I think a lot of their retaliation is going to be these kind of tit for tat formula and equation, that if they can't export oil, then no one in the region can export oil. And that's going to entail increasing attacks on regional, tankers, cargo ships, energy infrastructure, ports, things like that. UAE, Kuwait, potentially Saudi Arabia, even Oman has been struck recently. So again, it's existential for them. It's not, this is just, I view these things through a realist lens. No one's being nice. No one's, so this, and I think another point, just to circle back earlier. So I think, I would just argue that this clock, my assessment that it actually benefits Iran, that Iran can absorb more punishment. They have circumvention routes through to get past the blockade, that they have now much more spare capacity for, they've exported a lot of oil during this MOU. They have a lot of oil at sea, and they have much more capacity in their domestic energy infrastructure to now amass more oil without damaging that infrastructure. And then they have these overland routes. Interestingly, in the past several days, the U.S. has actually struck bridges and roads that kind of go up to Turkmenistan and go up to, to get to Russia. Iran is rebuilding those railroads. So again, it's going to be a tit for tat, but Iran has, again, a system of autarky, a political economic model of autarky, it's much more resilient and able to withstand these kind of pressures than the global economy, which is interdependent, the Gulf economies, which are interdependent, which rest on investor confidence, which rest on, the free flow of trade. So they have much less leeway. And for Trump, as you said, we have the midterms coming up. We have, all these issues of inflation, a lot of political pressures on him, and from both sides. There's been reports that, the fertilizer issue has been harming, agricultural industry in America, hurting farmers in Nebraska and red states. We've had all these kind of knock-on effects. So I think
there's the entire ecosystem, whether it's petrochemicals, whether it's food security. The World Food Organization had actually declared that if this continues, there's going to be a catastrophic emergency. So the entire ecosystem gets impacted by this. So I'm assuming that what you're implying here is that Trump will not be able to absorb this pain politically at home.
Yes, I mean, he's doubling
For
down
long,
on a
that.
failed strategy. I think the most important thing is that this strategy of like reflexive coercion towards Iran for decades, that we're not going to give them anything, we're going to use our economic leverage, our military leverage, our political leverage to coerce Iran and get everything from it. That hasn't worked. I mean, it's only created an Iran that has fought back even more harder and made all these problems that America has had with Iran, from its nuclear program, from its regional alliance network, its ballistic missiles, drones, ability to disrupt Hormuz. It's only exacerbated all these problems. And so Trump is doubling down for now on this failed policy. I don't think there's a military solution for him here because, again, as Assad said, the geography is the biggest issue. I mean, Iran is right there. America's far away. And then Iran can take these blows. I mean, Iran took over 13,000 airstrikes, a historically unprecedented air campaign for 38 days. They're taking a lot more now, but they have this infrastructure. They have these underground missile bases and drone bases. They're able to withstand these U.S. airstrikes, continue to hit back, and hit back even more accurately now, actually. They're learning, they're adapting, they're building. I mean, the population is much more mobilized and radicalized and entrenched. I mean, we saw these funeral processions for Khamenei last week. So they're going all out and they're right there. And Trump, you know, he has all these constraints on him at home, abroad. Nobody wants this war. And he's heading into the midterms, and we'll see how long his patience lasts here.
Yeah. Well, as they say, you can't pick up two watermelons with one hand. So he wants to pick up two. He wants to have an end to the war, and he wants to have an end to the war with a win. And he's not going to get a win. So he's got to choose which watermelon he wants to pick up. But Assal, I want to come to Lebanon, which is clause 1, part of clause 1 in the MOU. And the Americans, again, in bad faith, have tried this quote-unquote so-called truce between the Lebanese government and the Zionist entity, and essentially conditioned it on the Zionist occupation or their withdrawal on Hezbollah's disarmament, which obviously is a non-starter. But it seems to me that it is also by pressuring the Lebanese government, they're also trying to create space for some kind of civil war in Lebanon. What is your assessment of what is the policy thrust there?
Well, before we get into Lebanon, I just wanted to tack on to the conversation.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Because when you think about it, like when you describe, you know, there's the effect on this ecosystem that's being affected, and it's affecting everybody across the globe. It's being done for no reason. That can't be emphasized enough. Like, all of this crises that have been created have been entirely voluntary by Israel and the United States. And that's it. And and there is a growing public consensus, even in the United States, that is the case, which is why this war, unlike all previous wars that have been polled, I think we don't have polling from right around the Vietnam War, but basically every other war that you look at, even if you look back to 2003 in the Iraq War, despite massive protest movements, the vast majority of the American population at the time supported the invasion. Why? Because they believed falsely that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction and believed falsely that Iraq had a role in 9/11. All of those fabrications were meant to manufacture consent for that war. This administration didn't really bother to manufacture consent for the Iranian war, but also they failed at it miserably. The attempt to say that Iran was a nuclear threat, that Iran was going to wipe Israel off the map, that any of these things were happening. Why? Because Israel was literally wiping Gaza off the map while these discussions were going on. So it didn't work. And so you have a majority of Americans who didn't support the war, and now they're living with the consequences of something they never wanted because they were never under threat. So it's actually an insane situation when you look at it. When you look at Lebanon, in some ways it fits into this sort of paradigm of why is this happening? Why is Israel occupying southern Lebanon? They'll argue it's a security position, but of course that's not the case. They're occupying southern Lebanon because they have historically tried to occupy southern Lebanon. There's an open discussion of the idea of Greater Israel. Netanyahu, who is the current prime minister, has talked about his feeling a connection to the idea of Greater Israel. It is not hyperbole. They are acting on expansionism. It is an expansionist state because it wants to be a hegemon. And when you are what do you need to be a hegemon? More territory. How do you compete with a country that is a historic country like Iran that has the amount of geography and space that it has? You become an expansionist state, which is precisely what it is. When Hezbollah is talked about, it boggles the mind that people don't understand that Hezbollah exists because of Israeli occupation. It is a consequence of it. Israel did not invade Lebanon because of Hezbollah historically. Hezbollah came into existence because Israel invaded Lebanon. And so those same strategic policies that existed decades ago for Israel continue to this day. They want to occupy southern Lebanon. And they call it buffer zones and security zones. And so when you look at what is happening there, it is the model of impunity that we have seen in Gaza over the last 2.5 years, now expanded to Lebanon. Why? Because the Lebanese government has no way of fighting back. That is something that essentially Hezbollah has been able to do since its creation in 1982 against Israeli occupation. And Israel doesn't want to give up its occupation. So you see the contradictions in the MOU and then this ceasefire with Lebanon, when ultimately all of this is part of Israel's strategy to maintain its occupation and expand its occupation further into these territories that are sovereign and do not belong to it, including Palestinian territories that they've been occupying for decades illegally, which they are trying to annex very, very openly.
But might I add that this whole idea of Eretz Israel, it kind of inheres in the Zionist ideology. I mean, it goes back to the very beginning of Zionism. Menachem Begin was asked by a reporter about the Zionist entity's borders, and he turned around and he said, but they're all given in the Bible. So, and if you read, luckily the revisionist historians, for instance, Benny Morris, who obviously has decided to become a Zionist again, unfortunately, they're very clear about how David Grun and Weizmann and others were operating even before the Nakba. So I think, but I want to ask you, since you looking into this very closely now, is there a growing sense within the United States legislators? I'm not talking about Gen Z and the rest. We do have an indication there. But is there a sense within the legislators, within the power centers, within the corporate sector, that this is the case and that protecting and supporting the Zionist entity is not in the interests of the United States?
I think we're seeing some shifts. It's still very modest, I would say, on both sides. But what is interesting is that it's happening on both sides. So you're seeing a shift in political rhetoric, both on the left and the right. It's hard to, there's no left in the United States, but on what we would call the left in the United States, and on the right. So you have, for instance, a politician like Marjorie Taylor Greene, who was very much aligned with President Trump and the MAGA movement in the United States, clearly has conservative politics. What you would typically think is a base that supports Israel very, very staunchly in the US. And you see shifts there. I mean, just very open anger towards not just Israel and Israel's actions. All right, something as simple as, I mean, she'll frame it as, I'm a mother, and so I don't understand why we're okay with the mass slaughter of children. These are like basic things. So you see these shifts in language. You see it from people like Tucker Carlson, right? Again, a very, well-known conservative voice. And you're seeing these criticisms of Israel because not only is it its actions, but why the logic of trying to understand, why are we using our resources in this manner? Why are Americans suffering at home? So many Americans, especially the working class, can't afford basic necessities, healthcare. But for some reason, we have billions and billions of dollars to send in for Israel. You're also seeing it on the Democratic side. So more candidates who are rejecting AIPAC, who are openly saying, we will not take any money from AIPAC, who are winning races, right? AIPAC is pouring unprecedented record numbers of money into different races in order to beat anybody who is critical of Israel. And they'll argue that this is an American organization that is working on behalf of America. But in reality, they're trying to get rid of anybody who is critical of Israel in any way. And so there are definitely, I think, shifts happening. It does not match up to the population shift, though, right? As you said, we know that there is a significant shift in public opinion about Israel and Palestinians, essentially sympathy for Palestinians, or support for, say, weapons sales or military aid to Israel. All of that has very, very dramatically shifted within the American population, which is noteworthy given how propagandized that population is. But Israel's actions in the last 2.5 to 3 years have been so atrocious that it has broken through that level of propaganda simply because of the stream of horror that people have seen every single day. So it still doesn't match the population shift, but I think there is room to, believe or be hopeful, however you want to frame it, that there is definitely changes within the electoral process as well, and what politicians see as, before you could never criticize Israel. That was not, that was basically a death knell for a US politician, and that is no longer the case.
Yeah. Sina, before we sign off, I want to ask you another question with reference to the Europeans. Now we know that the Europeans were not only stupid, but also irresponsible in terms of snapback sanctions and the rest of it. We're talking about the JCPOA and all of that. They were not helpful at all. This time, and I'm not saying that they have changed their colors overall with respect to Iran. They still talk about, Iran's nuclear ambitions and the rest of it, but they have opposed this war. Do you get a sense that there is perhaps a shifting opinion with reference to how to deal with Iran as far as the Europeans are concerned? And to what extent is that likely to also impact the US choices?
Yeah, well, before I get into that, just to make a couple of quick points on the Israel point as well, which ties into the European question as well about Europe. So, I think, it goes without saying, particularly for us here, that Israel is not a normal country. There's nothing normal about it. Its political system, its foreign policy, much more so than I would argue other countries in the region, including Iran. That this is an ethno-supremacist state. It actually, it has territorial expansionist goals and objectives. It doesn't recognize borders, as was just discussed. So, for example, I was talking to quite a senior veteran U.S. diplomat recently, and who's negotiated with the Israelis for years. And he was saying, Israel is a small ethno-state that has expansionist ambitions, and it wants the other countries in this state, in the region, to also be made into small states, and for it to grow. It's kind of logical when you look at it from the Israeli vantage point, given what they are. And so, to that point, I think there is this inherent conflict between American interests in the region, if they're rationally defined, I would argue, and these things are increasingly debated in America and acknowledged, and what Israel wants and what is possible in U.S.-Iran relations. Like, if we look at, I think, U.S. and Iran have they have a lot of overlapping interests, room for cooperation, room for counterbalancing, great power rivalry in China and Russia, because Iran doesn't want to be overly reliant on them, under this current system. But Israel is the abnormal part of this equation that upsets this process. If we talk about, Vietnam has good ties with America now, and because of its rivalry with China or other countries, why is Iran so different? I think Israel is the biggest factor for why. And for example, I was, and with the other regional countries, I think, there's been a certain amount of naivete maybe in their leadership, and who would be next after Iran. Like, I was just on a call with Jonathan Schanzer of FDD, of the arch pro-Israel lobby in Washington, and they asked him what's next, and he was saying that we don't just have a terrorist state in Iran, we have a terrorist state in Pakistan, a terrorist state in Qatar, a terrorist state in Turkey, and he was trying to rile up these Americans to go after them next. So they're trying to use and exploit American power. You see the Israel lobby in America to go after all these other countries after Iran. Iran is the biggest boogeyman right now for them, but they have it out for Turkey and and Syria, this new Syria that if Assad was the problem, okay, now Assad's gone, and they're taking territory, they want to take
the great Ahmad al-Shara is there now. Suddenly he is he's caught.
My point is that so this is the critical issue right now in this region. And even I'm not going to get into this now, but if we talk about why hasn't there been democratization in the Arab world, and this order that rests on these authoritarian governments that is backed by the US, obviously I'm not going to blame everything on Israel, obviously, but they've also had an incentive in not having democratization in the Arab world and having these kind of corrupt client states that are as part of this order that is really a not sustainable order. And I think we're in this period of geopolitical shift, which actually is a good transition to the European question, is that we're in a period of geopolitical shift. Pax Americana is on the decline. This American global hegemony is on the decline. It's a very dangerous period. History teaches us that in these kind of great balance of power shifts, that the potential for great power conflict or regional conflict, these things are much higher, and we're already seeing it play out. The Europeans, have been in the U.S. camp pretty reflexively for decades, but this is a moment of shift and transition, and so we're seeing elements of this. We're seeing talk of this strategic autonomy. French have always been talking about this, but now with what's happening with NATO, with Trump's rhetoric, certain shifts from Germany, we'll have to see how that plays out. I mean, I think with respect to the Middle East, they get much more of their energy from the Persian Gulf, especially after they lost the Russian energy, and they need Qatari gas and whatnot. So they actually have much more at stake. So are they going to go all in with this grand project for decades that has been futile to transform the Middle East, to wage these destructive wars, to send hundreds of thousands of troops? It makes no sense. It's futile. So they have a strategic interest in overhauling their approach. Even with respect to Israel, we saw, for example, Macron recently went and visited Ahmad al-Shara in Syria. So we'll have to see how it plays it out, but I don't think Iran is counting on them at all. I mean, Iran sees them as a very irrelevant actor that has proven they can't really do much, that they're not helpful. And even right now, I think the Europeans are kind of engaged in a degree of hostility with Iran, a degree of, intervention, complicity in these attacks on Iran, whether that be Britain giving its bases, other countries, certain French forces that are in the region right now. So it's a volatile situation. This doesn't benefit the Europeans, but for them to actually change their policies and get to a certain degree, this is undergoing right now, but it's going to require a lot more political will, and we'll have to see these upcoming elections. For example, Le Pen wins in France, that's going to really change things big time. So it's a period of transition.
Yeah. No, I mean, there's so much more that we can discuss. But as I said, we got to sign off. But I will be remiss if I were not to mention how I actually came across Dr. Rad's name. And that had nothing to do with the work she does. That was something that she was doing on the sidelines, perhaps, when she started correcting these headlines. And those corrections were absolutely remarkable. And that's how I got to, get to know her. And then I started doing my research. That's how I came across her book, which then I got and I read it. And I've been trying to get hold of her. And good to see her. I got hold of you also. And it's great to know both of you. Just give me a sense of why did you start doing that? I mean, it was great, but what was the urge?
Well, thank you. I appreciate that, and just being on this program, especially sharing space with Sina. In terms of the headline corrections, it was something that I did before the Gaza genocide, because to my mind, and this is as a historian, even in the work I've done on Iran, narrative is so important. The way a story is told, that we always hear this idea, the victors write history, but really the way a story is told is incredibly important. And the way that the media has told the story has always been extremely biased, right? It's repeating whatever is the official position of the United States and, by extension, the Israeli governments. And that's not something that, I came up with. Of course, you look at the work of someone like Herman M. Chomsky and Manufacturing Consent, their seminal book, 1989. And because as a historian of the region and someone who's been focused on Palestine for such a long time, that particular narrative was something that always bothered me. And to me, it was a very simple exercise of how dramatically something can change with a few word changes here and there. It was the subtlety of the way people have been propagandized in the United States. And I think people think of propaganda in a very crude way. Effective propaganda is this. Effective propaganda is telling you you live in a country that has a free press, meaning it can hold its government accountable. It's supposed to be investigative. It's not supposed to just repeat and parrot government positions. It's supposed to tell you the truth, but that's not what we've seen. So I thought the visual was a very simple, almost wordless way of like, I didn't have to say anything. I would just do the correction, and anybody who would see it could see the difference within that one correction. And I'm happy to see that it's resonated so much with people.
No, absolutely. It was fantastic. Anyway, thank you so much, Dr. Assal Rad, Sina Toossi. This is all from this episode. If you like the discussion, click on the subscribe button and send us comments. Until our next episode, goodbye and stay safe.